This number appears in the Bible so often it cannot be ignored. Not hidden in obscure verses, but placed at history's most defining moments. It shows up when everything breaks, and when everything begins again. Rain falls for 40 days, covering the earth in relentless silence. A nation wanders for 40 years, searching for something they cannot see. A prophet walks 40 days alone, carrying exhaustion deeper than words. And after rising from the dead, Jesus stays exactly 40 days. The same number appears again and again at the turning points, and once you notice it, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because this is not coincidence, and it was never meant to be. Most people think 40 means testing, punishment, or spiritual trial seasons. And sometimes it looks that way. Painful, slow, and filled with uncertainty. But what if that assumption is only telling part of the story? What if everything you thought about this number is completely backwards? Because something happens after every single 40 in Scripture history. Something changes, something shifts, something is never the same again. And the deeper you look, the more consistent this pattern becomes. It is not just about what people go through during those moments. It is about what comes out on the other side of them. And this is where the meaning starts to flip completely. Because 40 is not the number of what God is taking away. It is the number of what God is quietly building beneath everything. Something enters those 40 moments one way and never returns unchanged. Not a person, not a nation, not even the course of history itself. And once you begin to see it clearly, it changes everything. Because the first time this number appears, the entire world is collapsing. And what happens next will redefine how you see every waiting season. Now look closer, because this pattern is not random at all. It appears exactly where pressure rises, and outcomes begin to shift dramatically. 40 days of rain, not 39, not 41, always precise. 40 years in wilderness, not a season shorter, not a moment longer. 40 days of fasting before purpose, before power, before public mission begins. And this is where your brain starts searching for meaning automatically. Because human psychology is wired to detect patterns that repeat consistently, when something repeats across generations, stories, and outcomes, it signals intention. And the Bible does this with numbers in a very specific way. Not as random symbols, but as structured language carrying layered meaning. In ancient Hebrew, numbers were not separate from letters and concepts. They were connected to images, sounds, and deeply rooted symbolic systems. The number 40 connects directly to a Hebrew letter called Mem. And Mem, in its earliest form, was shaped like flowing water waves. Not metaphorically, but literally drawn as moving water in ancient script. And that connection changes how you read everything that follows next. Because water in Scripture always carries a dual function simultaneously. It destroys what cannot survive, and it sustains what is meant to live. It floods the earth, but also cleanses and prepares it for renewal. It drowns armies, but parts open for freedom and new beginnings. So when you see 40, you are actually seeing a pattern of water, a pattern of destruction, followed immediately by transformation and rebirth. And suddenly, those repeated moments begin to connect in a deeper way. 40 is not just time passing, it is a controlled environment of change. A defined space where something is tested, revealed, and reshaped completely. This aligns with something modern psychology now understands very clearly. Sustained periods of pressure force identity shifts and behavioral rewiring. Not instantly, but through repeated exposure, challenge, and internal adaptation. In other words, transformation requires time under tension, not quick solutions. And that is exactly what these 40 periods represent across Scripture. They are not random delays, they are intentional transformation cycles. And here is the part most people completely miss until now. Every time 40 appears, something enters one way and exits differently. Sometimes stronger, sometimes exposed, but never exactly the same again. And that means the number is not just marking time at all. It is marking transition points between one identity and another identity, between who you were and who you are about to become. And once that realization clicks, you cannot read these stories the same. Because the first time this number appears, it does not test a person. It tests the entire world and resets everything humanity once depended on. And what comes after those 40 days will change everything forever. But here is where everything you thought about this number begins shifting. Because most people stop at the surface and miss what is happening underneath. They see struggle, delay, silence, and they immediately label it as punishment. They assume 40 represents testing, hardship, and seasons meant to break people. And yes, sometimes it feels exactly like that from the inside. It feels slow, uncertain, and painfully disconnected from any clear direction. It feels like nothing is moving, like progress has completely disappeared. But what if that interpretation is only telling half the story? Because if 40 only meant punishment, the outcomes would stay the same. But they do not, and that is where the pattern becomes undeniable. Every single time 40 appears, something changes on the other side. Not slightly, not temporarily, but in ways that reshape everything moving forward. And that forces a different question most people never ask. What if 40 is not about what you are losing at all? What if it is about what is being built while everything feels uncertain? Because transformation rarely feels like progress when you are inside it. In fact, neuroscience shows that identity shifts happen during prolonged discomfort phases, not during comfort, not during ease, but during extended periods of internal tension. When the brain cannot rely on old patterns, it begins forming new ones. That process feels confusing, unstable, and often completely invisible at first. And that is exactly what these 40 periods mirror across Scripture history. They are not moments of abandonment, they are environments of reconstruction. They are controlled spaces where old structures collapse to make room for new ones. And this is where the meaning flips in a way most people miss. 40 is not the number of what God is taking away from you. It is the number of what God is carefully forming inside you. Something unseen, something deeper, something that cannot be rushed or forced. Because anything built quickly without pressure rarely holds under real conditions. But what is built inside these seasons carries strength most people never develop. And once you see this pattern clearly, everything begins to reframe itself. The waiting is no longer empty, it becomes part of a process. The silence is no longer absence, it becomes a space for formation. And suddenly, those moments that felt like delay begin to carry meaning. Because the outcome is never the same as the starting point. Something always exits those 40 periods different than it entered them. And that is not accidental, it is intentional design at the highest level. So the real question is no longer why these seasons feel difficult. The real question is what is being shaped that you cannot see yet. Because the first time this pattern appears, it does not test one person. It tests the entire world, and what follows will reset everything humanity knows. And what happens during those 40 days will change history forever. The first time this pattern appears, the entire world stands on edge. Humanity had drifted so far that everything became corrupted beyond recognition. Violence filled the earth, and the original design had completely broken down. Nothing functioned the way it was meant to function anymore. So the response was not small, and it was not temporary either. Water came, not gently, but with force that covered everything known. Rain fell for 40 days, unrelenting, consistent, and impossible to escape. And from the outside, it looked like pure destruction and total loss. But look deeper, because this is where the meaning begins to reveal itself. Because water in this moment is not only ending something broken, it is also preparing something new that could not exist before this reset. And that dual function is what most people miss completely. Because destruction and renewal are happening at the same time here, the old world is being washed away layer by layer without exception. Everything unstable, everything corrupted, everything misaligned is being removed completely. But inside the ark, something very different is happening quietly. Life is being preserved, protected, and carried through the chaos outside. Not because it avoided the storm, but because it was positioned differently. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. 40 days did not just end a world, they carried something through it. But the most overlooked detail comes after the rain finally stops falling, because the story does not immediately move into a new beginning. Instead, there is another period that most people rarely pay attention to. Noah waits, in silence, for another 40 days before opening the window. The storm had already ended, but the transition was not complete yet. And that waiting period changes how you understand everything. Because even after the chaos ends, preparation still continues quietly. The world outside was different, but Noah had to be ready for it. And that readiness does not happen instantly, even after survival. This aligns with what psychology now calls post-crisis adaptation phases. After major disruption, the mind and identity need time to recalibrate. Even when the danger is gone, the transformation process is still unfolding. And that is exactly what this second 40 represents in the story. It is not about surviving anymore. It is about stepping into something new. Because when Noah finally walks out, nothing is the same again. The ground is different. The future is different. The relationship is different. And then something even more significant happens right at that moment. God establishes a covenant, a promise that redefines everything moving forward. Not before the 40, not during the storm, but after the full process. Which means the transformation was necessary for what came next. Because the covenant belongs to a world that had been reshaped completely. And this is where the pattern becomes clear for the first time. 40 is not just about what ends, it is about what begins afterward. It is the passage between collapse and creation, not just destruction. And once you see that, the story stops looking like punishment entirely. It starts looking like a controlled reset designed for something greater. Because something entered those 40 days one way and left completely different. Not just Noah, but the entire structure of human history itself. And that means the next time this number appears, you should expect change. Not small change, but identity-level transformation that cannot be reversed. Because the next person shaped by 40 will not just survive it, He will be completely redefined by it in ways no one expects. The next time this pattern appears, it shapes a single life completely. And not just any life, but one that will redefine an entire nation. Moses lives 120 years, divided into 3 perfect segments. Each segment lasts 40 years, and each one changes him completely. The first 40 years look like success by every human standard. He grows up in Egypt, inside power, wealth, and elite royal education. He has access, influence, knowledge, and everything the world values highly. From the outside, it looks like his identity is already fully formed. But underneath, something is still missing, something not yet aligned. Because knowing who you are is not the same as knowing why. And that difference changes everything as the story moves forward. At 40 years old, Moses makes a decision that shifts everything instantly. He sees injustice, reacts emotionally, and kills an Egyptian in secret. That single moment forces him to run, leaving everything behind completely. The palace disappears. The status disappears. The identity collapses overnight. And suddenly, the next 40 years begin in total obscurity and silence. He becomes a shepherd in Midian, far removed from power and recognition. No audience, no influence, no visible purpose, just repetition and isolation. Day after day, tending sheep that do not care about his past. And this is where most people would assume failure has taken over. But this is not failure. This is formation at the deepest level. Because everything he built in the first 40 is being stripped away. The confidence built on status is replaced with humility through obscurity. The voice trained in leadership is replaced with silence and listening. And something new begins forming where something old once defined him. Modern psychology calls this identity deconstruction before true alignment begins. Old frameworks collapse so new, purpose-driven structures can take shape. And that process is never fast, never comfortable, and rarely visible externally. But it is always necessary for long-term transformation to actually hold. Then one moment changes everything again, without warning or expectation. A burning bush appears, and a voice calls his name directly. Not in the palace, not in success, but in the middle of obscurity. And suddenly, everything he thought he lost becomes part of preparation. Because the next 40 years will demand something completely different from him. Now he is called to lead a nation out of slavery and into promise. Not with confidence from status, but with dependence built through emptiness. And those 40 years in the wilderness will test everything repeatedly. The people complain, doubt, resist, and often wish to go back. Nothing moves quickly. Nothing feels stable. Everything feels uncertain constantly. But something deeper is happening that most people cannot see. They are being fed daily, guided constantly, and sustained without failure. Manna appears every morning, provision that cannot be stored or controlled. A cloud leads by day, fire leads by night, constant direction present. Their clothes do not wear out. Their survival is continuously maintained. And this is where the meaning becomes impossible to ignore again. These 40 years are not punishment. They are transformation at scale. A group of slaves is becoming a nation with identity and dependence. And Moses himself is no longer the man who left Egypt years ago. He entered the first 40 as a prince, confident in human systems. He entered the second 40 as a fugitive, stripped of everything familiar. He enters the third 40 as a leader, shaped by something much deeper. And none of those transitions could have happened without those exact seasons, because each 40 removed something that could not go into the next stage. And each 40 built something that could not exist before that process. This is not random. This is structured transformation over extended time. And once again, the pattern holds without exception or contradiction. Something enters those 40 periods one way and exits completely different. And if that pattern continues, the next moment will go even deeper. Because Moses will face something on one mountain that changes everything again, not once, but twice, each time going further than before. Now the pattern tightens and the stakes become even more personal. Moses climbs a mountain, stepping into a space no one else enters. Cloud covers the summit, fire surrounds it, and everything feels sacred. He remains there 40 days, without food, without water, fully present. This is not survival. This is direct encounter at the highest level. During those 40 days, he receives something that defines an entire people. The law, the structure, the boundaries that shape identity and direction. And when he comes down, everything should be aligned and stable. But what he finds instead changes the entire trajectory instantly. The people have already turned away, building a golden idol in fear. They replace presence with control and trust with something they can see. And in that moment, everything breaks before it fully begins. The tablets shatter, the order collapses, and failure becomes undeniable. Now watch closely, because this is where most people misunderstand the pattern. You would expect the story to end there, with consequences and distance. But instead, something far more powerful begins immediately after failure. Moses is called back up the same mountain for another 40 days. Same place, same man, same duration, but a completely different outcome. And this is where the transformation goes deeper than before. Because the second 40 is not about receiving information anymore. It is about experiencing presence at a level that changes identity itself. He fasts again, waits again, but this time, something shifts internally. And when he comes down, the difference is impossible to ignore. His face shines with a radiance people cannot even look at directly, not because of what he carried, but because of what he encountered. This aligns with something modern neuroscience has begun to understand clearly. Repeated exposure to intense experiences rewires perception and internal identity patterns. The second exposure goes deeper because the first created initial pathways. And this is exactly what happens during these two 40-day encounters. The first 40 establishes structure. The second 40 establishes transformation. The first gives the law. The second reveals the nature behind the law. And the most powerful detail happens in between those two periods. Failure becomes the doorway to a deeper understanding than success ever could. Because after the golden calf, God reveals his character more clearly than before. Mercy, patience, and truth are declared in a way never seen previously. Which means the second 40 did not just repair what was broken, it revealed something that could not be seen without that breaking first. And that changes how you understand failure inside these seasons completely. Because sometimes the breakdown is not the end of the process. It is the exact condition required for a deeper transformation to occur. And once again, the pattern holds with perfect consistency. Something enters those 40 days one way and exits completely transformed. Not just externally, but at a level that changes how others perceive them. Moses does not just return with information. He returns different himself. And that difference becomes visible, undeniable, and impossible to replicate artificially. Which means 40 is not only about external outcomes anymore. It is about internal transformation that becomes visible to the outside world. And if that pattern continues, the next story will reveal something else. Because another man will walk into this process from a place of collapse. Not in strength, not in confidence, but at the absolute edge of exhaustion. And what happens during his 40 will redefine what restoration looks like. Now the pattern moves into a moment most people would call burnout. Elijah had just experienced one of the greatest victories recorded in Scripture. Fire fell from heaven, proving truth in front of an entire nation. Everything should have shifted. Everything should have stabilized after that moment. But within hours, everything collapses in a completely unexpected direction. A single threat sends him running, overwhelmed, exhausted, completely drained emotionally. He leaves everything behind and walks alone into the wilderness without direction. Then something shocking happens that reveals the depth of his condition. He asks God to take his life, saying he has had enough. This is not weakness. This is what complete emotional depletion looks like. Modern psychology describes this as nervous system overload after sustained intensity peaks. After extreme highs, the body often crashes into equally intense lows. And Elijah is standing exactly at that breaking point internally. Now watch carefully, because this is where the pattern shifts again. God does not respond with correction, judgment, or immediate instruction. Instead, he provides something surprisingly simple but deeply intentional: food, rest, and space to recover before anything else happens next. Because restoration begins with stabilization before transformation can continue forward. After Elijah regains strength, the journey begins without clear explanation. He walks for 40 days and 40 nights toward the mountain of God. But here is the detail that changes everything about this moment. The journey takes longer than it physically needs to reach that location. Which means the distance is not the point, the process is. Because transformation is happening inside the movement, not just at the destination. This aligns with behavioral science models of gradual recalibration under sustained movement. Progress is not always visible, but internal systems are being regulated continuously. And when Elijah finally arrives, the encounter does not match expectations. There is wind powerful enough to break rocks into pieces. There is an earthquake shaking everything that seems stable and grounded. There is fire, intense and overwhelming, impossible to ignore or control. But something unexpected happens that shifts everything again. God is not in any of those dramatic and overwhelming displays. Instead, a quiet stillness follows, almost impossible to detect at first. And within that silence, clarity finally emerges in a different way. A voice speaks, not loudly, but directly, cutting through the internal noise. And in that moment, Elijah receives what he truly needed all along: direction, purpose, and confirmation that he is not alone in this process. 7,000 others remain, even when it felt like he was isolated. And suddenly, everything begins to realign from the inside out. He is given a new assignment, a next step, and a future again. Which means the 40 days did not just carry him through exhaustion. They restored him, stabilized him, and repositioned him for what comes next. And once again, the pattern holds with complete consistency. Something entered those 40 days at the point of collapse, and something completely different emerged with clarity and renewed purpose. Which means 40 is not just about building strength or exposing weakness. It is also about healing what has been silently breaking beneath the surface. And if that is true, then the next example will show another side. Because sometimes 40 does not rebuild immediately. It reveals something first. Something hidden. Something uncomfortable. Something that cannot stay concealed any longer. And what happens next will prove that in a way no one expects. Now the pattern reveals a different side that most people avoid seeing. Not every 40 builds strength immediately. Sometimes it exposes hidden weakness first. And this moment unfolds not in silence, but in front of everyone watching. A battlefield forms, 2 armies stand, and tension fills the entire valley. Every day, a giant steps forward, challenging anyone to face him directly. His voice echoes across the field, shaking confidence at the deepest level. And this does not happen once. It happens again and again, consistently. For 40 days, every morning and every evening, the challenge repeats. Same threat, same fear, same silence from those who should respond. No one moves. No one steps forward. No one breaks the pattern. Because fear, when repeated without interruption, becomes internalized over time. Modern psychology calls this learned helplessness under repeated perceived threat conditions. When no action is taken, the brain begins to accept fear as reality, and that is exactly what happens to the entire army during those days. They are not just facing a giant, they are facing their own limitations. Each day reinforces the belief that nothing can be done to change outcomes. And this is where the 40 reveals something critical beneath the surface. It is not building courage, it is exposing the absence of it completely. But then something shifts in a way no one expects at all. A young shepherd arrives, not as a soldier, but carrying simple supplies. He hears the same challenge, the same voice, the same repeated threat, but his response is completely different from everyone else standing there. He does not see an impossible enemy. He sees a misaligned perspective. Because his identity was not shaped by fear, but by previous unseen victories. He remembers the lion, the bear, the moments no one else witnessed. And that internal history changes how he interprets the current situation entirely. This aligns with cognitive frameworks where past success rewires future perception patterns. Confidence is not built in the moment, it is built in hidden preparation phases. And suddenly, everything changes with one decision that breaks the pattern. One person steps forward where an entire army remained frozen for 40 days. Which means the 40 did not fail. It revealed who was ready all along. It exposed fear in many and clarity in the one prepared differently. And once again, the pattern holds without contradiction or exception. Something enters those 40 days carrying assumptions about its own strength, and something different emerges, either exposed or elevated beyond expectation. Which means 40 is not always about comfort, growth, or visible progress. Sometimes it is about revealing truth that cannot stay hidden any longer. And if that truth is faced correctly, everything can change in an instant. Because the next example will show a moment where entire outcomes shift, not through force, but through a decision made within a limited window. And what happens inside those 40 days will redefine an entire city. Now the pattern shifts again, and this time the stakes feel immediate. Not years, not decades, but a short window that changes everything quickly. A message is delivered into a city known for violence and corruption. Not hidden, not unclear, but direct, urgent, and impossible to ignore. 40 days and everything you know will be overturned completely. That is the message, simple, sharp, and filled with consequence. But here is where the meaning becomes more complex than expected, because the word used for overturned carries two possible outcomes. It can mean destroyed entirely, reduced to nothing without recovery, or it can mean transformed completely, turned into something different. Same word, same moment, two completely different potential endings. And that changes how you understand this 40-day window instantly, because this is not just a countdown toward destruction as it appears. It is a window where choice determines what the outcome will become. And this aligns with decision-based behavioral models in modern psychology. When urgency meets awareness, change can happen at accelerated speeds, because pressure removes distraction and forces focus on what truly matters. And that is exactly what happens inside this city during those days. The people hear the message, and something unexpected begins unfolding quickly. From the greatest to the least, a collective response begins to form. They do not ignore it. They do not delay. They act immediately. They fast, they turn, they shift direction away from their previous patterns. Even the king steps down from his position and humbles himself publicly. This is not surface-level change. This is full-scale transformation in motion. Because when awareness reaches a tipping point, behavior follows rapidly, and the entire system begins to realign within that limited time frame. Now watch what happens next, because this is where everything flips again. The destruction that was expected does not happen at all. Instead, the outcome shifts completely because the response shifted first. Which means the 40 days were never about guaranteed judgment. They were about creating a space where transformation was still possible. And that possibility depended entirely on what happened inside that window, which reveals something critical about how these seasons actually function. 40 does not force an outcome. It reveals and amplifies choice. It creates a defined moment where direction can change completely. And once again, the pattern holds without exception or contradiction. Something enters those 40 days on a fixed path toward one outcome, and something completely different emerges because a decision interrupts that path. Which means 40 is not only about process, it is about response. What you do inside the season determines what comes after it ends, and that changes everything about how you view time under pressure. Because the next moment will reveal the highest level of this pattern, not in a city, not in a nation, but in one individual completely. And what happens there will redefine everything that came before it. Now the pattern reaches its highest intensity, and nothing remains the same. This is not a nation, not a city, but one man carrying everything. Jesus is led into the wilderness immediately after his public identity is declared. Not by accident, not by choice, but directed into a controlled environment. He fasts for 40 days, facing pressure at the deepest possible level. Hunger grows, isolation increases, and physical limits are pushed completely. And this is where the testing becomes precise, targeted, and impossible to ignore. 3 temptations appear, each attacking a different layer of identity: physical need, personal validation, and ultimate authority are all challenged directly. These are not random. They mirror failures seen before in human history. Israel failed under pressure, choosing comfort, proof, and control over trust. But this time, the response shifts in a way no one expects. Jesus answers differently, grounded in truth rather than immediate relief. He refuses to let hunger redefine purpose or direction in that moment. He refuses to test what does not need proving under pressure. And he refuses to trade long-term truth for short-term power. This aligns with cognitive resilience models under extreme stress conditions. Identity anchored in core beliefs resists external pressure far more effectively. And that is exactly what happens throughout these 40 days completely. Every response reinforces alignment instead of breaking under pressure, which means this 40 does not expose failure. It establishes authority. Because what emerges from this wilderness is not the same person. It is someone fully aligned, fully prepared, and ready for what follows next. And everything that comes after will be built on what happened here. But the pattern does not end in the wilderness. It continues further. And this final moment changes everything most people thought about 40. After the resurrection, Jesus does not leave immediately as expected. Instead, he remains for 40 days, present, visible, and deeply connected. Not fasting, not fighting, but simply being with those who follow him. He eats with them, walks with them, and speaks about what comes next. This is not a season of testing. It is a season of preparation. But preparation here looks completely different than anything before, because it is not about pressure, it is about understanding and alignment. The disciples had seen everything, yet they still did not fully understand. Fear, doubt, and confusion still existed beneath the surface of belief. So these 40 days become a space where clarity replaces uncertainty. He explains, opens their understanding, and connects everything they experienced. This aligns with learning models where repetition and presence build deep comprehension. Transformation is reinforced through consistent exposure, not just single moments. And that is exactly what happens during this final 40-day period. Confidence replaces fear. Direction replaces confusion. Purpose becomes clear again. Because soon, everything will change, and they will have to stand alone. But they are not being left unprepared. They are being equipped intentionally, which means this 40 is not about survival. It is about readiness. And what happens next will depend on what was built during this time. Because when this 40 ends, a new chapter begins beyond anything expected. And this is where everything stops being about them and becomes about you. Because patterns only matter when they begin reflecting your own reality. You have felt seasons where nothing moves, nothing changes, nothing responds. Moments where silence feels louder than any answer you hoped to hear. You try, you wait, and still nothing seems to shift forward. And the hardest part is not the struggle. It is the uncertainty itself. It feels like you are stuck in a space with no clear direction. But what if that space is not empty the way it appears? Because every example we have seen follows the same structure clearly. Something enters those 40 seasons one way and leaves completely different. Not instantly, not visibly, but through a process happening underneath everything. Modern psychology calls this hidden transformation beneath conscious awareness levels. Change occurs internally before it becomes visible externally over time. And that means what you feel right now may not reflect reality fully. It may reflect the process, not the outcome that is forming. Because pressure, waiting, and silence are not signs of being forgotten. They are environments where deeper alignment is being built carefully, and that changes how you interpret everything you are going through. Because maybe this is not a delay. Maybe this is preparation instead. Maybe this is not absence. Maybe this is presence in a different form. Because what comes out of these seasons is never the same as before. And if that is true, then your current moment carries more meaning. Because what happens next depends on what is being shaped right now. And now the pattern stands complete, consistent, and impossible to ignore. Every time 40 appears, something is being shaped beneath the surface. Not randomly, not without purpose, but with precise, intentional design. A world was reset. A man was transformed. A nation was formed. A prophet was restored. A city was changed. A mission was launched. And none of it happened outside the process. It happened inside it. Because 40 was never just about surviving difficult moments in time. It was always about becoming something that could not exist before. And that changes how you see your own life right now completely. Because if you are in a season that feels slow and uncertain, it may not be empty. It may be forming something you cannot see. Something stronger, something clearer, something aligned at a deeper level. Because what enters these seasons one way never leaves the same. And that means your story is still moving, even when it feels still. Because the same pattern that shaped everything before is still active now. And what comes next will reflect what is being built inside you. So do not rush the process, and do not misread the silence. Because what is forming right now will carry you into what comes next.